It all started during a severe thunderstorm. There was terrible commotion at the Duchess's estate. The maids ran around the estate. They had to bring a lot of hot water and towels because the Countess was bleeding heavily.
When she gave birth to her second child, they were very worried,
because the baby, for some reason, was not breathing at all. And the Countess's condition continued to worsen at that moment. A little girl with beautiful red hair walked into the room at that moment, and she will forever remember the room that was filled with the smell of blood. She also heard deafening screams and bustling footsteps at the moment when she saw her dying mother and her stillborn child. And terrible memories immediately flooded her vulnerable soul. And these memories were about her past life. She remembered how her father constantly beat her and scolded her, and then he himself went into another room and drank a lot. The 7-year-old little girl, of course, could not withstand this shock and simply lost consciousness. Of course, the maids who were present there, seeing this, were immediately very scared. They did not understand what had happened to her and tried to bring her to her senses, but it was difficult. Thus began her new life, the life of Irene Tirlon. Some time passed since then, and Iran was already 9 years old. One fine sunny day, she was riding with her uncle in a carriage. The man asked if she, the girl, was by any chance worried. Despite the fact that she was still a little worried, she replied that everything was fine. The man explained that the Duchess was her mother's cousin, so she would certainly take care of the girl as best she could. Now, Iran did not have a decent life in the ruined Count's house, and because of this, he was a little sad to send the girl there. Her uncle thought that if only her father had not squandered his fortune on wine and gambling, then everything would have been completely different. Irene, hearing this phrase, immediately remembered that all this was exactly like in the novel. On the day of her mother's death, she raised her voice. That all this was not real, this was the world from the novel. And she had a chance to read this novel in her past life. It was an ordinary love story. A hero who was ready to do anything for his beloved. The girl was reborn, not as the main character, but as a girl named Irene, the very same villain who mocked the hero in the Duke's estate. And then, mysteriously, she died before she even reached adulthood. Ren from the book was frighteningly similar to the girl's previous life. This similarity especially alarmed her when she began to remember more and more moments from her previous life. Devastation, cold and hunger, all this awaited her now, too. It's true that now that she was reborn and found herself in Ren's body, she had food at least once a day. She really believed that she could cope with all this. But it turned out that there was something much more terrible than hunger. And that thing was loneliness. In these silent halls the girls had to endure for 2 years, until Count Tirlon, her so-called father, died in a gambling brawl. Later after this, her uncle appeared and decided to send the girl to the ducal house. Of course, Irene knew everything in advance and was no longer surprised by what was happening. But even realizing her future, the 7-year-old girl was not able to change anything. Therefore, she simply had to obey what the adults told her. So she ended up in this carriage that was taking her to real death. In any case, Irene at least hoped that there would be warm food and a room in the duchy. But she soon realized that she had better not console herself with these empty hopes. It was all useless. She was not the villain from the book, and if she was careful, the Duchess certainly should not have been disappointed in her. And the future hero definitely shouldn't hate Irene. She believed that, perhaps, if she behaved completely differently from the original character, her fate could change. Well, the girl still didn't know what to expect, so she didn't even console herself with such hopes, but simply waited for what awaited her ahead. After some time, they finally reached the desired estate. As soon as the Duchess of Leto Carlos saw the girl, she immediately realized that she was Vanessa's daughter. Irene looked at her with a slightly frightened look, but told the woman that everything was true when she saw Duchess Carlos. She now understood what she was like in reality. But Summer, looking at her red hair, the girl suddenly grimaced. She was afraid that perhaps she would be disgusted by this color, and because of this, she could get into some trouble. Then the woman turned her gaze to her luggage and asked if these were all the things she had arrived with. Irene said in a quiet voice that everything was exactly like that. Then the woman turned away from her and replied that she did not have children and she needed guardianship, and she was ready to take care of the girl so that she would not need anything. However, she had one condition. The woman asked Irene not to cause trouble for Carlo's house. The little girl immediately bowed thanked her ladyship for this favor, and promised that she would not do anything like that. Then the woman, leaving, said that the maid would take her to a new room. She needed to rest properly, since the journey was not short. When Irene heard all this, she was sincerely shocked. She did not expect that the girl would turn out to be colder than she had assumed. A young and beautiful maid accompanied the mistress to her room. She said that if she needed anything, she could only call her, and everything would be done. Irene, seeing the room in which she was now supposed to live, was amazed. Because after the previous conditions, this room turned out to be a real paradise for her. There was a lot of space there, and it was not just a guest room. She realized that the Duke's direct heirs probably lived in this place. Now the girl understood why that original Irene behaved so carelessly. It was very easy for us to succumb to temptation. In fact, a normal aristocrat, starved for wealth, suddenly received all this wealth, and of course she imagined herself to be the mistress of this house. And even she did not suspect that her stupid antics would not bring the Duchess's favor, and that ultimately, all this impudence could end very badly. Irene approached a small indifferent and, sitting on it, realized that the Duchess did not like the color of her hair. She thought about what she could do about it. The girls certainly didn't want her to get angry with her, so she tied her hair in a braid and assumed that she would always have to style it neatly so that it wouldn't become a new irritant. Carlos shouldn't be given any reason to be dissatisfied. If she's careful, at least they won't hate her. Then Irene went to the mirror and looked there and thought about whether such little things could really change her sad fate. I even know the plot of the whole book. She was still absolutely powerless to change anything. She could not avoid moving even to the Duke's house. Therefore, Irene had no idea whether she could now, by just slightly adjusting her behavior, break the predetermined future. And most importantly, is she confident that under any circumstances, she will be able to refrain from the stupid things that the original girl did? All this was very upsetting for Irene. But then suddenly, a maid knocked on her door. She said that it was time for dinner, so it was necessary to escort her to the dining room. The girl immediately stood up from her seat and said that she was ready, after which she went there with the maid. When the Duke entered the dining room, Irene was already sitting in her place. She understood that she needed to show politeness according to the rules of etiquette. Therefore, rising from her place, she approached him and, bowing, said her name. When she was about to say where the man came from and understood everything, he said that she was an emaciated 9-year-old girl. Since they took her under their guardianship, from that moment on, she was now part of the Carlos family. This man's name was Ampere Casaros. He said that she would receive all the privileges of their house, but she should not even think of forgetting her responsibilities in the process. The girl curtsied and immediately thanked him. The man simply ignored it and walked past, sitting down at his place and telling them to start dinner. By that time, the Duchess had already come down, and they all began their meal in complete silence. In fact, Irene expected something similar from a military leader who earned his title on the battlefield. He pressed her with authority. So much so that she even found it hard to breathe at some moments. She seriously doubted that she would be able to really find some common language with him. Ultimately, that same evening, the girl fell ill with indigestion. However, when the seasons changed and winter arrived, Irene, very quietly but completely, got used to this quiet life. To her initial apprehension, everything the Duchess gave her, food, clothing, and the same everyday things, all seemed incredibly luxurious to her, something she couldn't even dream of in her past life, or in this one. So Iran couldn't believe that she really had to wear something like that. After some time had passed since her death, the Duchess also decided to hire a special tutor for her. When the Duchess saw the surprised expression on the girl's face, she immediately asked if she didn't like studying. She replied that it was all simply not like that. She simply did not expect that she would be given such a wonderful opportunity. Leto explained that as a ward of the ducal house, she had to receive a proper education and manners, so it was her responsibility. The girl said that she would make every effort, but she herself remembered that in her past life, she had been rather mediocre in her studies. Therefore, Irene suggested that perhaps if she showed good results now, the woman would be able to praise her at least a little and would not be so disappointed in her. She was so carried away by this peaceful life that she even completely forgot about the main character who was supposed to appear soon. One evening, the girl accidentally dropped a cup and immediately began to pick up the pieces. But her personal maid ran up to her. She asked the young lady to let her clean it up. She shouldn't have done it herself. Her name was Lithia. The girl asked her for forgiveness. She said that she did it simply out of habit. After all, she had long ago become accustomed to actually doing everything on her own. Then, suddenly, Irene heard some noise coming from the closed door and immediately became interested in what was happening there. When she looked out, she saw that many butlers were running past. They had to urgently tell something to the master and the Duchess. The girl realized that some guest had probably come to visit them. However, she had not heard that anyone was supposed to arrive, and because of this, she became a little wary. When she went out onto the veranda and looked down, she saw a boy with dark blue hair there. The girl immediately recognized him. This boy had the same golden eyes as the Duke, but there was a daring glint in him, and at that moment, she realized everything perfectly. And all because it was Anton Carlos, the main character of this novel, who was supposed to lead the villain to her death. In other words, Anton was Irene's killer. Therefore, when the girl saw him, she was scared, but what alarmed her most was the fact that the wheel of fate, albeit slowly, but inexorably, made its move. In fact, this boy was the illegitimate son of Duke Carlos, and it was with these lines that the novel began. His real mother was a commoner. However, immediately after giving birth, the mysterious one disappeared, along with Anton. And 7 years later, he returned alone to the Duke's house. And that day finally came, and Ren was incredibly scared. After he entered the estate and stood in front of one of the paintings looking at them, the girl decided to come to him to say hello. She tried to make a friendly appearance, approached Anton, smiled, and said hello to the boy. The guy turned sharply towards her and looked at her with a stern gaze, but didn't even say anything in response. The girl, in turn, said her name, and also that she was a distant relative of the Duchess, and lived in this place under her care. Irene was really very scared to even talk to him. However, she knew that if she was kind to him, then perhaps fate could at least change a little for the better. She also really hoped that he wouldn't be able to notice the fear she felt in her voice. She decided to ease the tense situation a little, so she said that the man in the portrait is the head of this house. He earned his title on the battlefield and raised the mouth of Carlos. She said that he was revered throughout the entire duchy. Some say that he had been looking for Anton all these years. She was sure that he would be incredibly happy to see him again. But the boy suddenly said, in a very rude voice, it was all nonsense. He replied that he was not looking for him, but for a replacement for himself. That is, an heir. Then Anton suddenly asked. Maybe he looked like a fool to her who believes in terrible children's fairy tales about a loving father, because this was not true at all. When Irene heard all this, she was very shocked. He was just a small child and thought so cynically. She was even afraid to imagine what he had gone through over all his years, since he had already spoken like that. In the novel, Anton really couldn't stand even the mention of his mother. Now she understood why. It was enough to just look at him for everything to become clear. Children who have experienced cruelty from their families always feel rejected by the world. And Irene knew this no less than this boy. Therefore, they had something in common. She still decided to establish contact with him and make sure that he did not lose faith in the Duke. She said that he was a strict man, but still fair. If he needed an heir, the Duke could have had a child with his new wife, or chosen someone from his relatives. However, he did not give up, and continued his search all this time. She smiled and asked Anton if he thought that this meant that for the Ampere, the boy was something more than just the heir of his family. The guy, having heard this theory, was of course a little surprised, because he had not considered the current situation in this light. When the Duke returned back to the estate, he went into the room where the children were. They continued to stand near the painting and look at it. The first thing Ampere did was approach his son, and for some time just silently looked at him. Irene was very surprised that he showed up without even taking off his cape. This was very strange. He didn't even shake the snow off his back. Then the girl realized that he was really in a hurry, so she was glad that the Duke was also looking forward to finally meeting his son. But at that moment, Amber suddenly looked at the boy and, in a very rude, angry voice, asked what he was doing in this place. Anton, like Irene, was very shocked by such words, because the boy already believed the words of the girl who assured him that his father would be happy. The man said that he would like to know where his mother Nabuya was now. The boy suddenly lowered his head down and said that he did not know. Then he suddenly took out a small medallion from his pocket and said that she said that if I fall in love here and show this, then you will listen to me. The Duke, seeing this, was very amazed. He could not even answer anything. At that moment, the Duchess of Summer appeared behind them. She saw the necklace of harmony and immediately understood everything. It was that very gift from his lordship to that woman that she was happy that the relic of the House of Carlos had finally returned. The man, meanwhile, took the medallion in his hands and began to examine it. Then he suddenly laid it in his fist and said that first it was necessary to make sure of its authenticity. In the meantime, he asked the maids to prepare a room for the boy. Anton suddenly looked in surprise at Summer, who was supposed to be leading all these preparations, and asked why this was necessary. The woman came closer to him and said that it was all about the necklace. She didn't understand. Wasn't it obvious? She looked him straight in the eyes and said that he had the same golden eyes as Carlos. After Summer stopped looking at him, she turned to Pavel and asked the butler to escort the young master to the best room on the 4th floor of the main wing. Having bowed, the man was immediately about to do so, but the Duke, who was still standing there at the time, was very surprised when he heard about the 4th floor. He asked why she couldn't send him to the room on the 3rd floor, but Summer, smiling, replied that she had already told him that she had given her to the Russian Federation. She assumed that the man simply didn't hear and therefore didn't remember. She explained that she was very sorry for such a room to be empty, so she put the girl there, thinking that it would be the right thing to do.
When Irene saw the Duke's angry look, she was shocked. She could not believe that the Duchess had given her that very room.
In fact, it was the room that the Duke kept especially for his son all this time in the novel. It was said so by order of the Duke. The room was furnished with expensive furniture and kept in perfect order until the return of the heir. Now she understood why there was only a new dressing table there, because in a boy's room, there would definitely not be something like that. It was the only thing that had appeared there in a long time. Summer continued to explain her position. She said that she believed that it was definitely not appropriate for a young maiden and a young gentleman to live on the same floor. For Mr. Anton, the 4th floor was more appropriate. There were spacious chambers there, not inferior even to the 3rd floor. The Duke pondered this for a while, but then, as he was leaving, he agreed with the woman and said that he could rely entirely on her opinion in matters of the children's placement. At that moment, Irene realized that her entire plan had collapsed. All this time, she had not wanted to disturb anyone, but her very presence had become the cause of discord in this house. But then Anton suddenly turned to her, seeing her frightened face, and asked if she really believed that the Duke was glad to see him. The girl didn't even know what to answer to this. Plus, her plan simply fell apart in an instant. But Anton, turning around, suddenly said that she probably couldn't help but notice that this man didn't even ask his name, so everything she said was complete nonsense. He sighed heavily and said that it was precisely because of this that he could not stand red-haired girls. The boy even grimaced just looking at her. At that moment, Irene realized that looking at her hair, he saw his mother. Because of this, Anton was very angry and told her to stop pestering him and leave him alone. He no longer needed her advice or help. That evening, the girl had a terrible nightmare. Everyone got angry at her, shouted at her, and even someone hit her. She also saw a red-haired woman in her dream. Anton kept accusing the girl of looking like her. Irene woke up in the middle of the night, choking on her tears. She brought her breathing back to normal and realized that she had again had that disgusting dream that she had seen more than once. Ever since Anton Nightmare appeared, he began to visit her more and more often. And in the Duke's house, complete silence reigned, which had not happened since the moment she arrived there. This silence felt like the calm before the storm, and that only made the girl more afraid. She didn't know what to expect. When Irene was walking along the corridors heading to her room, she saw a maid who immediately ran up to Lydia and saw that she was carrying several books. The girl smiled and said that she had probably carried these books to her room and asked her to give them to her because she could have carried them herself. But the woman replied that she shouldn't have done that. They were quite heavy, so she was going to carry them calmly herself. Irene took the books from her and said that she could handle anything like that herself, so the maid didn't need to worry about it. The girl thanked her for her concern and ran into the room as quickly as possible so that Lydia would not take these books from her. She couldn't get used to the fact that she was being looked after in this place, so sometimes it was easier for her to just do everything herself. As she climbed the stairs, she thought that her Lydia was always busy, and if she could handle something on her own, then of course she would want to do so. But then suddenly, Anton started to come down to meet her. Their glances crossed, but for some time, they did not say a word to each other. At that moment, the boy suddenly extended his hand, and Irene became scared and thought that he was going to push her. She clearly had a scene in her head of her falling down the stairs and all her books scattering, and because of this, she even dropped several books that she was holding in her hands. The girl realized what had happened and immediately began to pick them up and asked the boy for forgiveness for this. Laughing nervously, Irene said that she didn't want to scare him. She was just lost in thought, and the books slipped out of her hands. Anton just sighed heavily and began to walk past her. He didn't even say a single word to her. The girl really hoped that these books were not damaged too much, because then the responsibility was not sweet. But rather quickly, she collected all these books and began to climb back up, because she was very uncomfortable. This whole situation was very stupid, and Iran felt ashamed because of it. She climbed up to her floor and scolded herself, because even without this situation, the young gentleman looked at her with contempt, and now he would definitely decide that she was completely hopeless. Then, suddenly, passing by the window, she saw that Anton had gone outside and was heading towards the forest. She did not expect that he would decide to go there. It was incredibly cold outside. He was wearing nothing but a thin shirt. He had no outerwear and was heading to a remote part of their territory. This made her very wary. She understood that at this rate he would simply catch a cold, but then she remembered his angry look and all the words he said to her and realized that she probably shouldn't even worry about it. In response, she would only receive more barbs, so she decided not to pay attention to it and went further to her room. At that time, Anton was already deep in the forest. There was snow on the ground and he was really very cold, but for some reason, he did not go back. After some time, he suddenly heard the girl's voice that sounded behind him. She said that it would soon be dark, so it was better for him to return home. When he turned his head back, he saw Irene. She put on a cape for herself and took it for him. The girl was breathing heavily because she was trying to run to him very quickly. The boy saw her and became very angry. He asked what she was doing in this place. Irene smiled and replied that it was still the territory of the duchy. However, if you don't know the way, you can easily get lost, so she was afraid for him. Anton, of course, was in the group again. He said that it didn't concern her at all, so he asked her again not to meddle in other people's business. The girl replied that she was simply worried about him and had no intention of making him angry, after which they simply stood in silence for a while. No matter how much she tried to convince herself not to pay attention to him, she still couldn't. This bone-chilling cold and loneliness were all too familiar to her. She knew better than anyone what it was like to be alone in such a couple, so she decided to lend him a helping hand, because no one had ever done anything like that to her. Irene gave him a cape and said that he would get very cold in such clothes. She did not have time to take anything warmer. However, she decided that this could at least warm him up a little. She smiled and said that he could ignore it and even continue walking if he wanted, and then they could simply return together to the estate so that he really wouldn't get lost along the way. At that moment, Anton suddenly smiled maliciously. He came closer to her and said that she was trying too hard. She pretended to be such a kind adult in his opinion. She courted the whole mansion, even fawned over the maids. He asked if she really liked feeling superior to others, playing the benefactress in this way. He suddenly grimaced and said, "Your fake expression just makes me sick." It was very painful for Irene to hear all these words. The boy simply turned around and started to leave. He didn't even take his cape. Of course, she really always liked to smile at everyone, because in her past life, she couldn't do this, so it was very unpleasant for her to hear his accusation. Then, Irene decided to take a different approach. She made a snowball out of snow and threw it right at the back of his head. The boy felt it immediately, turned around, shouted loudly at her, and asked what she was doing, and most importantly, why. She came closer to him and said that he was right. She had worried about him in vain, and now she even regrets that she went so far in such cold to him to give him a cape. She said that she didn't have that much time to think about him all the time. She gave him the cape and told him that he could do whatever he wanted, and that she wouldn't worry anymore. Irene turned around and started to leave. She said that she was returning and that she couldn't get sick or cause inconvenience to others. And all because, unlike him, she could not do as she pleased. Anton, hearing all this, became very angry. He grabbed the cape in his hands and asked if she was really mocking him. After that, he took her hand and stopped her and asked how they were so different. The girl asked if it was true that he was the heir to the ducal house. Anton, hearing this, became even more angry. He did not understand what, in her opinion, could give him this title. The boy said that his father was not interested in him at all. The Duchess considered him a burden, and deep down, Irene despised him just as much. He was absolutely sure of it. The girl didn't answer anything to this. She only asked why he didn't leave if he was so sad about all of this. Anton had nothing to say to this. He himself didn't know why he didn't leave. In the end, sighing heavily, he said that she still wouldn't understand it. After all, she was born with a golden spoon in her mouth, so they were completely different. At least in these moments. After a short silence, Irene suddenly said that it was she who envied him. She explained that this was happening because he could easily be rude, rebel, and generally do whatever he wanted, and they would still leave him in this house under any circumstances. But she had no other place to hide from the cold and hunger, so she had to adapt, serve, and please, just so they wouldn't throw her out. Irene understood that he was sick of her helpfulness and pretense, but she simply couldn't do otherwise, because this was the only way she could hold out for at least one more day. When the next day came, Irene's maid came to take her to dinner again. The girl still felt a little guilty about the previous evening. She didn't understand what she had done at all. She had tried so hard to avoid conflicts with Anton, but now everything had turned out completely differently. Now he probably hated her completely. That's why she even felt sad thinking about it. Irene couldn't believe that because of her one stupidity, everything could go according to the original plot of this story, and then her chances of salvation would definitely be over. When she was heading to dinner, she suddenly sighed heavily and heard Anton's voice behind her, who said that she was sighing too loudly. The girl turned back and, seeing him, was amazed. Anton, who had until now ignored all the invitations of the dukes, suddenly appeared in the dining room. This was definitely something unusual. She asked if he had really come to have dinner with them, and why, in that case, he was still standing and not sitting at the table. Anton felt a little uneasy about this, turned away from her, and said in a quiet voice that he didn't know where he could sit. Smiling, she realized that no one had accompanied him, and he had come to this place on his own. Of course, she helped him choose a place to sit. She was very happy with his behavior, and assumed that he was not angry about yesterday. Irene sat down opposite him, and said that his lordship and his wife would be arriving soon, and that they would be very glad to see him, so he didn't have to worry. But Anton still looked somehow dissatisfied and stern while they sat in silence. The girl felt how awkward it all was. She thought about what she could talk to him about. But soon the Duke and Duchess entered the room, and they did not have to talk. When the Duchess saw Anton, she suddenly saw that he had taken Irene's place, and told him about it in a very rude voice. She asked who allowed the boy to sit in that place. Anton himself was amazed. After all, it was the girl who sat him there, so he even thought that she did it on purpose, so that he would be scolded. The lady turned to the butler and asked who had escorted Mr. Anton to the dining room, before the man had time to answer. Irene suddenly screamed loudly and said that it was she. Lowering her head before the Duchess, she said that she herself gave up her seat to him. Anton, as the heir of this family, should sit in this place, so everything was fine. The Duke had already sat down at the dining table and simply suggested that they begin eating. He was not at all interested in such squabbles. Of course, the Duchess did not like this situation, but she overcame herself and sat down at the table. Irene then breathed a sigh of relief. She realized that in this place, she couldn't relax for a second, because everything could go wrong even after a small performance. After this dinner had passed in complete silence, the girl went back to her room. However, towards the evening, her stomach began to hurt again. All this happened because of constant tension. She hadn't had anything like this for a long time, so she decided to go down to get herself some soothing water. She was also going to take some medicine for herself so that it would help. And then, suddenly, when Irene looked around the corner, Anton appeared right in front of her. The guy definitely didn't expect to see her at such a late hour, so he was very surprised to see her. The girl herself was very scared and immediately screamed in fear. And after that, she asked what he was doing in the middle of the corridors at such a late hour. Anton was a little embarrassed. Then he said that he was going to her room when Irene heard this and was very surprised. She immediately asked why he had come to her room. He explained that he wanted to discuss something with her. Irene could not believe that he was really independent and decided to come. She even thought that he wanted to talk about what happened yesterday. Anton immediately asked her to listen to him, but then the children suddenly fell silent because they heard some rather strange sound behind them. In fact, it was coming from the Duchess's room. There were some sighs there, and a male voice could also be heard gently shouting the word, "Mistress." Irene immediately understood what was happening there, so she was very scared for Anton. The girl covered his ears. She explained to the guy that it would be better for him not to hear such things. But most of all, the girl was very surprised because she clearly saw His Highness leave after dinner. She did not understand how this could have happened and whose male voice was coming from the Duchess's room in a fit of passion. Anton was very indignant. He asked why she was covering his ears. He also wanted to listen, so he asked her to immediately remove her hands. At that moment, Irene realized that the Duchess had most likely cheated on the Duke, but then she thought about it and realized that the Duke had actually betrayed her first. But still, it was a real disaster. Anton finally removed her hands from his ears. He shouted loudly at her and asked what she was doing. The girl quickly put her finger to her mouth and told him to be quiet. The guy was about to continue the scandal, but he didn't have time because a voice came from the Duchess's room asking if there was someone behind the door. Irene was very scared. She didn't know what to do. After all, if the Duchess decided that she was eavesdropping, she would definitely hate her. Anton, who was holding her hand, suddenly felt how much she began to shake. It was quite strange, and he did not understand why she suddenly began to worry so much. In the end, he took her hand a little more weakly, and looking straight into her eyes, asked her to stop trembling like an aspen leaf. He led her along, and said that they needed to leave because Irene was stressed. She nevertheless agreed and followed him. But at that moment, she felt very strange. After all, just yesterday she was afraid to even approach him. But now, next to him, she felt, on the contrary, very calm. And so, while the children were walking away from that room, they accidentally bumped into the Duke, who was walking towards them. She looked at the children in great surprise, because he certainly didn't expect to see them. For a while, they just stood and looked at each other. Irene herself was amazed. She did not understand what the Duke was doing in this place, since he had left. She had to behave calmly and not let on that something had happened. Therefore, the girl turned to the Duke and asked if he had really returned so quickly. Ampere replied that everything was exactly like that. His business had ended a little earlier, so he returned, but the man asked what they were doing in that place in the corridor at such a time. Irene quickly replied that she had just had a nightmare, and it was incredibly scary to be alone. Anton came by to console her a little, so that she wouldn't be so scared. Anton himself was very surprised by what she said, because nothing like that had happened. The Duke then came closer to his son and asked if this was really true. The boy understood that it would be best to agree, so he nodded his head in confirmation. Ampere replied that showing concern for an older sister is quite a brave act, so he even praised his son, saying that he was a good boy. The boy, hearing this, was amazed. His cheeks even turned red. He didn't expect to hear this from his father, who had ignored him all this time. However, the Ampere replied that he had acted like a true representative of the Carlos family, so he was truly glad that the boy had done so. When Irene heard that the gloomy Duke praised the boy, she was pleasantly surprised and understood that it was very good. The girl took Anton's hand and thought that perhaps this incident could bring them closer together. And this was very important. In the end, the man, having sorted everything out, said that since everything had calmed down, they should return to their rooms, and he needed to go to the summer. The girl, hearing this, immediately understood that this situation would not end well. It was impossible to allow him to return to his room. If he goes to the Duchess now, he will get her with her lover, and their union was already very fragile, so it will finally collapse after this. She assumed that she herself, as a relative of the Duchess, would be thrown out of the house without hesitation. So Irene had to act quickly. The girl ran after the gentleman, grabbed him by the sleeve, thereby stopping him, and asked him to listen to her. Ampere looked at her in surprise. After all, she had never shown such courage before. He was also interested in what she wanted to tell him. The girl herself was angry with herself. She didn't understand how she could stop him, and even called herself an idiot because she didn't understand why she did all this. In the end, Yu said, in a lying voice, that she was still afraid to return to her room. The Duke understood that he could not leave it all like this. Therefore, he turned to Pavel and asked him to bring 3 glasses of warm tea with milk into the living room. A warm drink always calms the mind, so he had to help. She explained that she would stay with them until they could finally return to bed. When the children heard this, they were incredibly surprised. It was clear that this was not the case with the Duke. After all, he had never behaved like this before. They assumed that, most likely, the Duke was even much kinder than they thought about him. So, the children agreed to this proposal, and together they went to the living room. At the same time, the Duchess was not far from them. She nevertheless left the bedroom in order to check what the sounds were, and, seeing this whole situation, the woman suddenly frowned. When the next day came, Irene called Sagini, and from the very morning, the girl was very seriously worried about this. She didn't understand why she had to do this, and thought that perhaps she even suspected something about the previous night. In front of the door to the Duchess's office, she tried to calm herself down because she was very worried. But eventually, having gained the courage, she knocked and asked if she could come in. Such did not allow her to do this when Iran entered the room, then bowed and asked if she wanted to see her. But Summer immediately got down to business. She said that yesterday, she probably decided that she had done her a favor. However, her intervention was too unnecessary. The girl understood that now she would be scolded very harshly. She decided to pretend for a while as if she did not understand anything. But the Duchess looked at her and asked her what she thought she had done last night. Of course, Irene couldn't answer anything. It was too wrong. The Duchess would have guessed everything from her expression right away. She said that Irene turned out to be quite a smart girl. She knew that the girl was sensible beyond her years, but she didn't think that it could be to such an extent. The girl didn't answer anything. She was very ashamed. She just stood with her head down and couldn't even look at the Duchess. Summer replied that their house had been looking for a person for a long time. Her name was Niobe. The girl, hearing about this, was very shocked. She did not understand why this was happening at all. The Duchess said that she had been hiding all this time, and now suddenly decided to send only her son. She was sure that she had a hidden plan. As a Duchess, she did not dare to treat this lightly, because it could be very dangerous. Irene was shocked to hear this, but Summer explained that the man who was in her bedroom was hired to find Anton's mother. At that moment, the girl was in terrible shock. She could not believe that the Duchess was really going to find Anton's mother. That evening, the man told her that a red-haired woman whose description perfectly matched the wanted woman had recently been spotted near the duchy. However, as soon as they started pursuing her, she simply disappeared as if by magic. The Duchess sighed heavily and said that she had not allowed them to enter her chambers for such reports, and that in the middle of the night she had expected something more important. She even asked whether perhaps she should hand over this matter to other, more professional people. The man immediately became very scared. He screamed loudly and asked the lady to wait. He assumed that someone was hiding her, and that was why they were unable to find anything normally. Summer, hearing this, was a little surprised and immediately asked who could do this. When the man was about to answer her, they suddenly heard sounds coming from the corridor. The woman immediately realized that these were children's voices. She told the man that they would discuss this issue another time and said that their conversation was over. Now that the Duchess had told her the whole story, Irene realized that the male voice in the bedroom was a spy, and she thought absolutely terrible things. The Duchess asked if the girl really believed that she was the Duchess, Carlos could tarnish the honor of the family in such a way. Irene was incredibly ashamed that she thought so. The girl immediately screamed, saying that of course this was not true. But she herself could not understand how she could even imagine such a thing. Summer looked at her for a while, after which she suddenly said that the girl was not at all like her naive mother. She also suggested that she should hire additional mentors to ensure that such incidents never happen again. Irene, having heard about the mentors, immediately asked what it meant, and the Duchess, opening the curtains, explained it to her. She said that the girl would study the management of the duchy's affairs as her assistant. Irene certainly didn't expect this. She couldn't believe that someone would want to make her responsible for running the duchy. Soon after, the girls did hire additional teachers, and eventually a woman was also hired to teach her and Anton how to dance. They trained for the third time throughout the whole morning. Anton felt very awkward about this, but after a few hours, they started to do quite well.
Iran was constantly wondering why the Duchess was so determined to find Anton's mother. Niobe barely appeared in the original story, so it was strange. She appeared only when Anton had already completely grown up. When the girl thought that she suddenly stopped dancing, of course, the teacher got angry because of this. She told her to concentrate and not get distracted. Irene asked for forgiveness and said that she would continue. And some time passed from that moment, and finally, the teacher allowed them to take a short break. After all, the children were already tired. Anton, leaving the room, asked if she hadn't gotten enough sleep last night. The girls were very embarrassed, but she said that everything was exactly like that. All night, she was tormented by a bad feeling, and she did not understand what it was connected with. Because of this, she worried even more. Then, the girl suddenly remembered that last night, when they were accidentally caught by the Duke, he went to tell her something. So she now asked what it was. The boy replied that he wanted to talk to her about her place at the table. Irene smiled and asked if he was still worried about the Duchess's words, but she immediately said that he shouldn't have done that. Everything was fine. But the guy said that in fact, that wasn't the issue then. She was even more surprised and immediately asked what the problem with her place was then. Anton replied that he didn't care about his status and that her sacrifice was of no use to him, so he didn't want her to give up her place to him. Irene replied that both that place at the table and her room on the third floor were originally intended for him, so she simply could not accept all this, knowing that he had now returned. She said that he was the heir of the Carlos family, and that is why all these privileges were originally intended for him. But the boy suddenly became indignant and said that she should become the heir. Of course, Irene was very surprised to hear this, and told him that of course she could not do that. Anton then asked what the problem was. She was smart after all. There was no commoner blood in her veins. And besides, he didn't want her future to be ruined because of his position. She certainly didn't expect to hear this from him. At that moment, the girl even suggested that perhaps he was worried about her. She even had tears in her eyes when Anton saw this, and was very scared. He thought that he had even done something wrong, and asked why she suddenly started crying. Irene immediately smiled and said that he just said it so seriously. He didn't look like himself, and because of this, she was very surprised. The boy was even more surprised by this. But she explained that the Herzen title is not something that can be acquired through diligence or hard work. It is a huge responsibility, but also great power. So she explained that one day he would want something so much that the title would become the key to his goal, so he should never give it up. Soon, their break finally ended. The teacher came back and said that they should have continued until the end. Irene said that the boy should not refuse something so rashly. Then, they continued dancing, and Irene realized that before, he hated her with all his soul. But now, after some time, their relationship had changed significantly. She thought that perhaps the plot where Anton kills her had now also changed. At least, she really wanted to hope for it. And so, 2 years have passed since then. The girl worked diligently. At that time, Anton was already 9, and she was 11 years old. One fine sunny day, during one of their dance practices, the girl approached Anton and asked if he had forgotten that Baron Bond's family would be visiting them after lunch. The guy sighed heavily. He didn't understand what difference it made whether they came or not. He didn't care anyway. But Irene, smiling, asked if he understood that as the heir, it was his responsibility to greet them properly, especially if the visit was coming from a vassal house. The guy didn't like all of this. He considered it all a big hassle and didn't want to bother with all of this. But the girl, indignant, said that these families would become his support when he inherited the ducal title. Some say that the Baron's son would also arrive with them, so it would be nice to drink tea with them and make friends. Anton had no choice, so he listened to his sister, and when Baron Bonnet's son, his name was Ethan, appeared, they greeted him properly. After examining the mansion, he said that they had a rather majestic estate, a true home for such a noble family as theirs. Irene was a little worried. She did not understand why the boy had such a rude tone. She smiled and said that everything was really so. She was also amazed when she first came to this place. At that moment, he suddenly came closer to her and said that he had been told a lot about the girl. She was as refined as befits the daughter of a count's house. He bowed before her. Irene was a little worried. She thanked him for the compliment, but she herself did not understand what he was doing at all, and most importantly, why. Then Ethan suddenly plucked up his courage, took her hand, and asked if she would do him the honor of being alone so that they could get to know each other better. The girl was very scared when she heard all this. Anton, who was watching what was happening, was also indignant. He approached the Baron's son and asked what he was even allowing himself to do. Of course, he didn't like this kind of attitude towards Irene. When Ethan heard how he was insulted, he became very indignant and asked the guy if he really had the courage to throw around such words. Anton was about to ask what else he could be called, but then he suddenly looked at Irene and realized that she didn't want him to continue this conflict. The guy had no choice but to listen to her, so he sighed heavily and said that the guy was funny. And after that, he simply left. Ethan continued to be indignant. He asked if he really dared to run away from their conversation. Irene decided to at least slightly salvage this situation and asked if the man would like to drink tea or hot chocolate with her. The boy indignantly replied that he was no longer a child, so he asked for regular tea. He definitely didn't want hot chocolate. Irene sighed heavily and thought that Anton, as always, had ruined everything. After all, she had asked him to become friends with the Baron's son. For him, this would have been the best decision. But he ended up ruining everything at that moment. Ethan said that this heir had quite a temper. His mother told him to endure all this, otherwise he would have stopped restraining himself long ago and would have said a few kind words to him. When Irene heard that Mama had started to forbid him something, she immediately asked what exactly she had said. Ethan, in order to impress her, said in a cheerful voice that she said to ignore any rudeness. On his part, after all, he was an unknown degenerate, so you need to behave with caution. After that, he told the girl that it was probably very difficult for her to look after this brat, and he felt very sorry for her because of this. At this moment, Anton had already started to go back. He took something from his room. However, upon hearing this conversation, he stopped. Ethan continued to talk nonsense. He said that they say his mother also did a lot of things. A low-born woman who dared to settle in the Duke's house. Irene no longer wanted to listen to all this. She turned to the Baron's son in a rude voice and said that Mr. Anton was the only heir recognized by His Majesty. And so she asked him to be prudent and watch what he said, because it could still carry its own responsibilities in the end. Anton, hearing that she began to defend his honor and name, was pleasantly surprised. She had never shown anything like this before, but now he was happy that she stood up for him. Itano felt a little uneasy. He asked for forgiveness and said that he felt that the girl would be able to understand him, and because of this, he opened up a little. But he also said that, however, it didn't matter, because she would soon marry one of the vassals of the duchy, and most likely, just him. Irene was terribly shocked to hear this. She immediately asked where he got that from, but the boy explained that she was an orphan and had no close relatives left, and her fate depended on the will of the Duke and Duchess. Therefore, the best solution is to choose a family close to the court as her spouse, and, given her origin, their family is the most reasonable choice. He also added that becoming part of the Bones family would only benefit them, so he was quite confident that her guardians would make the right decision. Anton could no longer listen to all this. He suddenly, abruptly, risked the door and went inside. And Rin, seeing him, was very shocked. She understood that he had nothing good in his thoughts. The boy ignored her words. He immediately ran to Ethan and hit him right in the face. The girl tried to separate them. However, they were much stronger. Soon after this incident was over, all the parents were called. Of course, the Baron was very outraged. He could not believe that they did this to his son. The man started shouting. He said that even if they had a hot temper, this did not mean that they could resort to physical violence. Of course, the Duke turned to Anton and asked him to explain the whole situation, and, most importantly, why he did this. The boy was offended. He didn't say a single word, he just turned away from his father and looked somewhere to the side. Ampere. Of course, this really upset him. He turned to his son, calling him by his full name, and asked if he really hadn't heard him, since he didn't want to answer his question. The boy continued to remain silent. He didn't care what his father told him. He didn't want to say anything. To prevent Anton from feeling worse, Irene intervened in the conversation. She said that everything happened because he stood up for her. The Duke, hearing this, was very surprised and immediately asked what they were talking about. The Duchess also became wary and did not raise the question of why it was necessary to stand up for the girl. Irene explained that Mr. Bonney had stated that since she was an orphan, the ducal house itself would find her a suitable groom, and made it clear that she would be married to him. Of course, Anton, hearing this, was furious. Although when they insulted him, he didn't even utter a word. He didn't care about it. But when it came to her, he couldn't stand it. The Duke then asked what exactly the insults directed at Anton were. He should have known this. The girl said that he called him an unknown degenerate, and even a scum. When Ethan's parents heard this, they were very surprised. His father immediately hit him and asked what kind of outrage he had allowed himself to do. He started shouting at his son and told him to immediately apologize to my dear Lord and Lady Trilon. He never had the right to speak like that, or even think about it. Ethan immediately burst into tears, but he eventually asked for forgiveness because he knew that otherwise it would only make things worse for him. After this incident, the Bonnet family hastily left the ducal residence because they could not stay there any longer. It was all too awkward for them. And the Duchess was incredibly outraged after this. She said that the fact that their family had long served their house did not give them the right to treat members of the ducal family as servants. The girl never told them that they had to endure such attacks without a word. However, they had to tell her the whole truth right away, she said, so that the children would always tell her about such things in the future. Summer approached the girl and said that the Duke was also angry, and the House of Bonn would definitely pay for the insolence they showed that day. Irene could not believe that someone could stand up for her honor like that. She did not know why the Duchess wanted to stand up for her honor so much. However, Anton, who used Sira against the Baron, was very upset. The girl noticed this, so that evening she came to him, brought him dinner, and asked to be let in before they were noticed. In fact, he was punished for what he did, so the girl conspired with her maid and was able to bring him some food, because he was probably hungry. The boy immediately began to eat, after which she said that it was very good that the Duke did not recognize her, and the Duchess allowed her not to go to dinner as punishment. At that moment, Anton suddenly asked her if she really wasn't angry at all after what he said. Smiling, the girl said that, in fact, it was even a little ridiculous and cute. When the boy heard that she called him cute, he got angry again, but she laughed and said that it was not at all in the sense that he thought. Then she decided to explain everything to him, so that he would not attack anyone again. Irene found him sweet in his simplicity. He was like an open book. The girl said that adult aristocrats are much worse. They whisper behind your back and spread dirty rumors. But he acted completely differently. He said everything straight to your face. At that moment, she removed the crumb from Anton's face, who still hated these vile aristocrats and everyone who offended him and Irene. The girl smiled happily and thanked him for standing up for her. It was very thoughtful on his part, and really important. The guy was very embarrassed when he heard this. His cheeks immediately turned red. He couldn't even look her in the eyes, so he quickly turned away. When Irene noticed that his cheeks were very red, she immediately asked if everything was okay with him. She was even afraid that he might have a temperature, so she touched his forehead to check it, because it could really be very serious. The boy was even more worried about this. He quickly pushed her away from him and asked her to leave him alone. Irene was very surprised. She didn't understand why he was so angry at her, since she hadn't done anything wrong. But Anton said that he was already very sleepy, so he asked her to go to her room. Then the girl looked at her watch and realized that it was really quite late. She took the empty plate and began to leave. Before leaving, she told him not to think about skipping classes tomorrow, because everything would be even worse. He would do better to follow the rules, at least in such moments. But Anton, indignant, said that he would rather get some sleep than waste time on such nonsense. Hearing this, Irene became very indignant. She suddenly stopped and said that he was at it again, and asked if he really intended to continue to get into a fight and be punished for the slightest offense. She warned him that he was growing up and it was time to realize his situation and come to terms with it, rather than try to resist, because it wouldn't help anyway. Anton sighed heavily and asked if he would attend the lesson, then she would not marry this nanny. Irene certainly didn't expect to hear this. The boy repeated his question again, and she replied that, of course, she didn't know what would happen next. Of course, it was not she who decided, but the Duke and Duchess Anton, who, upon hearing this, was very indignant. He asked why they should decide her fate instead of her. The girl explained that this was all because she was under the care of their home, and was obliged to obey those who took care of her. She said that at the moment, they were the ones who managed Carlos's house. This means that if they decide that she should become part of the Baron's family, then she will simply have to marry him, whether she wants it or not. She said goodnight to Anton,
and then left. 2 years ago, when his mother brought the boy to this estate, she said that this was the place where he was born. Of course, Carlos's first impression of the estate was that it was incredibly large, and we couldn't even believe that ordinary people could live there. Mom then gave him that decoration and told him to show it to those who lived in this house, and they would immediately understand who he was. And then, step by step, he had to take back what was rightfully his. Then she would return when the right time finally came. Then his mother smiled maliciously and said that when that time comes, they will not begin to take revenge on those who tried to use her. The woman asked if he would do this for his poor and unhappy mother. Of course, Anton, upon hearing this, was shocked, because he understood that the woman herself was trying to use him. Now that several years have passed and he has grown up, he realized that earlier he thought that if he was kicked out of the duchy, it would be at least a small consolation to see how angry his mother would be. But now he didn't care about it, because he had something important in this place, and it was Irene. So while she was there, he was ready to become anyone, even a duke, for her sake. But at the same time, the guy was not going to let anyone take away from him what was dear to his heart. That evening, the boy came to Irene's room. He abruptly opened the door and said that he needed to have a serious talk with her. At the same time, she was sitting at the dressing table and combing her beautiful long locks. As soon as Anton saw her, he was so amazed by this beauty that he even froze in place. The girl was so scared when she saw him that she even dropped the comb from her hands. She asked in a sharp voice why he didn't knock. Irene explained that she was already getting ready for bed, so she let her hair down. And now, because of him, she would have to do everything again. So she asked him to leave for a while. When the guy saw this red curly hair, he realized that it was exactly the same as that of the woman whom he hated with all his soul. Anton didn't go anywhere. He said that he had long been wondering why she always tied her hair back. He asked if it was because he once said that he hated the color red. He remembered very well that he had said this at their first meeting, and he thought that perhaps she remembered it too. In the past, he really treated her incredibly coldly. However, that was in the past. Now, he has radically changed his attitude towards Irene. When the girl was about to say something, Anton warned her that she didn't have to remove them in front of him. He wasn't at all disgusted by her hair color. The girl, hearing this, was very surprised and immediately said that he had said those words back then and that was why she thought so. Anton replied that he definitely couldn't stand other red-haired people, but the girl was not the person he hated. Of course, he said so at their first meeting because they reminded her of his mother, the one who gave birth to him. However, now he realized that they were completely different, and it was stupid to compare. He said that her hair was incredibly beautiful. When the girl heard this, she could not understand that he was saying this seriously, and immediately asked if it was true. But then suddenly, she realized how strange it all looked from the outside. Therefore, Irene got up from her seat and asked why he came at all. After all, he was going to sleep. Anton then smiled, stood up, and said that he wanted to say that he would now take his studies seriously. When she heard this, of course, the girl immediately became happy. She asked if this was really true, and also added that he finally understood how important it was, and that it was wonderful. Anton agreed with her and said that, as she had said, he needed to understand his situation, and that he had found in this place something that he wanted to protect at any cost. So his motivation had increased. When Irene heard this, she was a little surprised, but there was confidence in the boy's eyes. He never intended to let anyone take her away from him. And from that very day, Anton really began to study much more diligently. This immediately became noticeable. And now, 3 years have passed since that moment. And for Irene, it felt like in one moment the lady was already quite big, and she turned 14 years old. One beautiful sunny day, the girl went outside because there was a wonderful autumn breeze, and she wanted to take a little walk. However, she was interrupted from her thoughts by a maid who was looking for her mistress. Lydia said that her teacher's geography lesson was canceled that day, and she had very urgent things to do. Therefore, she had some free time. The girl was a little surprised when she heard about this. However, she thanked her for telling her. But then suddenly the maid gave her a compliment. She called Irene incredible. She said that in some noble families, girls don't even touch geography books, but she was completely different. In fact, this was really true. If trouble happened, knowledge would help her survive. and that is why she tried so hard to remember all the information. All these years, she was given the same knowledge as the direct heir. The Duchess personally taught Irene absolutely everything that a noble lady should know, for which she was very grateful. This idol is not eternal before the force of the plot. In the original story, Irene does not even live to adulthood, so the girl understood that she did not have as much time left as she would have liked. Of course, now she and Anton were quite close. However, she could not be sure of her future. She did not know what would happen next. If Irene wanted to survive, she would have to leave this place. So she had to be prepared for the life that would await her outside the estate. After a short silence, Lydia told the girl that the Duchess might not let her marry because she was so smart and useful at home, so it would be very illogical. Irene laughed and said that it was very unlikely, but the maid did not understand why the girl thought so, because in some families it is women who inherit the mouth, so it was impossible to lose faith. Irene was unpleasant to hear all this. She immediately said that the Carloses already had a legitimate heir, and she was only a breadbasket. So, a scenario like the one she had imagined could never have happened. The maid immediately became worried. She realized that she had said a little too much. Therefore, after asking her for forgiveness, she replied that she had not meant it at all. But Irene didn't get angry with her. She said that she understood everything and simply asked the girl to be careful if anything happened. She said that if she had to leave, she would remain to serve the Duchess, and such words could seriously harm her. Therefore, in the future, Lydia must control herself. At that moment, Anton, who was standing nearby, suddenly heard these words and immediately came to the girl and asked why on earth she was going to leave at all. Irene looked at him in surprise. She didn't think that he would be next to her after his training, because usually he went straight to the estate. Irene decided to change the subject of the conversation in order to avoid answering his question, and asked if he had already finished his fencing lessons for the day. The boy got very angry and started yelling at him. His cheeks turned red with anger. He told her not to avoid answering under any circumstances. At that moment, he even came closer to her and asked if she really was going to leave this house. Irene turned to her maid and asked her to go ahead, and she would come to her soon. She did not want the maid to hear this whole conversation. When Lydia had gone far enough, Irene turned to him and told him that he needed to work on his emotional control. She explained that it was not proper for the future Duke to flare up like that and show his weaknesses, but Anton ignored her words. He wanted to hear an answer to his question. That's why the guy again asked in a serious voice if it was the Duchess who ordered her to leave this place. The girl said with difficulty that he should definitely learn to choose the right words, just like she did in the end. The girl said with difficulty that in a few years she should debut in high society. She couldn't rely on the Duke's goodwill all her life. She needed to prepare for an independent life as well. When Anton heard all this, he became even more angry. He asked, did this really mean that she was already preparing to leave? At that moment, he took her hand because the girl reached out to wipe the sweat from his face, but the boy did not allow her to do so. But Irene said that everything was really like that. She was just a guest in this house. Therefore, sooner or later, she had to leave anyway, and the girl thought that it was best to do this prepared. After that, she still wiped it off his face. Anton was so shocked that for some time he couldn't even say a word. And when he was about to answer something, you didn't have time because suddenly, several guys about his age approached him from behind. One of them came closer to him and said that he was very glad that they finally found him. The girl was surprised to see them, because she didn't know who they were. The red-haired guy looked at Anton and immediately saw how he became shy because they all paid attention to the girl who was standing next to him. The guy understood that it was impolite to just stand and look at her, so he bowed, greeted the girl, and introduced himself. His name was David. He and Anton were fencing. Irina greeted him and said that she was very pleased to meet him. She also said that she was from the Bowen house. In fact, she knew David. He was the son of one of the vassal families. This meant that he was a rather influential boy. David smiled and asked if it was true that the girl was Anton's sister. He also added that now he understood why he never said anything about her. The guy said that if he had such a beautiful sister like Ren, he would also hide her from everyone. The girl smiled. She thought that this guy was quite nice and thanked him for the compliment. But then Anton suddenly became very rude and immediately asked what sister meant. David, seeing his angry expression, immediately became scared and realized that he had done something wrong. but he did not understand why. But then Anton suddenly turned to Irene and asked why she hadn't corrected him, since she was still just a guest in this house, as she had told him just a few minutes ago. The girl was very scared. She had never seen him in such a state. It seemed to her that he was even ready to scream in anger. David tried to calm him down. He put his hand on the guy's shoulder and told him to think about what he was talking about. It was very impolite to communicate like that. At that moment, Irene herself thought about the words that she constantly repeated to him. However, she did not understand why this time everything seemed completely different. Finally, after a short silence, she said that she was older after all, so she was like a sister to him, even if they were not related by blood. Irene did not understand why it was quite painful for her to hear these words. All this was very strange. When Anton heard this excuse, he already wanted to say something, but did not have time. The girl felt uncomfortable staying there for a while longer, so she moved away from him and said that she had to go already. She turned to the guys who were still watching what was happening in surprise and said that she was pleased to meet them. She understood that if she stayed there for even a second longer, she would not be able to hold back her tears, and that is why she walked very quickly back to the estate. Then suddenly Anton shouted after her. He tried to stop her, but of course the girl didn't listen to him. She just walked on. Irene told herself that she shouldn't have cried. He simply told the truth, that's all. She shouldn't have been offended by it. In the end, the guy was able to catch up with her. He turned to the girl and asked her to stop. Irene was finally able to hold back her tears. She stopped, but she was still quite a distance away from him. The girl put on a fake smile, which was very difficult for her. He immediately asked why she did this and left so quickly. But Irene apologized and said that it was certainly rude on her part, and she was very sorry that she put him in such an awkward position. The girl also said that in the future she would be careful not to disgrace the name of the house. Anton became even more angry because of what she said, and he replied that that was not the point at all. Irene didn't understand anything at that time. She asked what the matter was then, and the guy sighed heavily and asked if she really believed the nonsense he had said just recently. He explained that he simply repeated her words, and she acted like an idiot if she was offended by this, since she herself was wrong in all this. When she heard what exactly he said, she was very shocked. At some point, the girl even thought that he was simply making fun of her. But Anton continued talking. He said that the girl always reads faces. However, for some reason, this time she did not notice that it was an ordinary joke. He told her in a rough voice not to take everything so seriously, because he really didn't mean anything bad. Irene couldn't believe that he actually said something like that. She got angry now and asked how she could not take everything to heart. The girl went out of her way every time to be recognized, so he had no right to treat it so frivolously. She was already tired of being afraid that everyone around her would hate her. Anton was amazed. He had never seen a girl lose her temper and behave like that. It was all very scary for him. But she continued to scream. The girl asked that everyone stop treating her like that. If he really considered her family, he would call her sister all the time. Anton couldn't believe that she actually said something like that. In the end, the girl simply turned around and started to leave. She had no reason to stay there any longer. The guy immediately asked where she was going, but Irene told him not to dare follow her. After all, it certainly shouldn't have made any difference to him. She even left her umbrella behind, which she threw aside in anger. By that time, a strong thunderstorm had started. The girl was walking through the forest and was already all wet. Irene was still very angry. She couldn't believe that the guy really treated her like that after everything she had done for him. But in reality, everything that she had been storing up inside herself all this time ultimately simply could not stay there any longer, and she threw it out. All her life, she had done just that, and tried to be worthy of love. However, taking it out on Anton, even if he had grown taller, was still unpleasant for her. She continued to consider this guy a little boy who did not deserve such behavior. She was even more surprised by his face when he tried to stop her. He looked so confused and even scared. Irene realized that she needed to go back and apologize to him, because no matter how angry she was, she still shouldn't have taken it out on him. First, she needed to at least find her way back, because out of anger, she didn't even remember the area she was going to. Everything around was now unfamiliar.
But at that moment, lightning suddenly struck a tree that was right behind her. This sound of thunder and lightning really scared the girl. Hearing it, she immediately screamed and then realized that she couldn't even stand on her feet because the earth was too wet. Irene felt her body begin to fall. However, she couldn't do anything about it. The girl couldn't keep her balance. But at that moment, quite strong arms suddenly grabbed her. When she turned her head back, she saw that it was Anton. He told her in a quiet voice not to be afraid. He was nearby, so everything was okay. The girl could not believe that he went looking for her. She took his hand and, looking straight into his eyes, asked why he was alone. Anton replied that the guards were, of course, also looking for her. They were combing the other side of the forest, but he simply found her before they did. Irene still didn't understand anything. She asked why he went with them. He could have assigned others to do this, and he himself could have sat quietly in the dry area and waited. The guy was not happy to hear this, so he said that for him, the word family never meant anything good. At that moment, he decided to continue the topic of their conversation that they had started a few minutes ago. The guy said that his family was the woman who gave birth to him and abandoned him, as well as the Duchess, who hated him for being born at all. And of course the Duke, who was always cold and distant from everyone around him. So he hated his family. At that moment, Anton even burst into tears and said, looking the girl straight in the eyes, that he wanted his sister to become the same so-called family that only caused him pain. When Irene heard these words, she couldn't hold back her tears either. The guy continued. He said that this didn't mean that he considered her a stranger all this time. That's why he asked her not to leave him. After all, he wouldn't be able to cope alone with all these fake people who surrounded him. At that moment, the girl thought that even being that stubborn guy, he sincerely confessed his feelings and weakness. And this meant a lot for boys his age. Therefore, she hugged him and smilingly thanked him for calling her sister, and also assured him that she would always be on his side. For a while, they just stood and hugged, and somehow the rain magically stopped pouring and the sun came out. Anton smiled and hugged the girl back. He was pleased that she had finally forgiven him, and everything had worked out between them. By that time, even the guards were able to find them and escorted them back to the ducal residence so that they would definitely not get lost again. And as it turned out, due to Irene's sudden escape, a real commotion arose. So as soon as they returned back to the estate, they were immediately met by the Duke and Duchess, who were very angry. Of course, Irene was very scared. She understood that because she had run away, there would now be a lot of problems. And therefore she was afraid that she wouldn't even be able to collect her things before they kicked her out. But the Duke turned to the girl in a rough voice and asked what had awakened her to such a reckless escape. She lowered her head and thought about the fact that they were definitely disappointed in her, so she needed to somehow correct this situation. The girl continued to hold Anton's hand. She was thinking about what she should answer them. The guy noticed how much she began to worry because her hand suddenly began to tremble. Therefore, he decided to answer for everything for her. Anton stepped forward and said that it was his fault that she left. He dared to call his sister an ordinary guest in their house, and because of this, of course, she was offended and had every right to be. When Irene saw that he decided to stand up for her, knowing that the punishment could be severe, the girl immediately screamed and said that it was not true. He was only stating a fact. The Duke and Duchess, hearing all this, interrupted the girl. Ampere said that, whatever the reasons, a complacent departure from the residence is completely unacceptable. Half of the guards were combing the forest in a very heavy downpour. Moreover, she made the family worry. So he thinks that the girl should seriously think about her behavior. Irene, as soon as she heard that he called them a family, was very shocked. This had never happened before, so it was very surprising for her. But the Duke said that responsibility for her upbringing lay with the Duchess, and it was she who would, of course, determine the punishment for the girl for such a smug act. The Duchess of Summer looked at the girl with a very disappointed look. For a while, she was simply silent and thought about this whole situation. And finally, having decided on the punishment, she said that Irene would be under house arrest for a week. This also concerned Anton, since there were two people to blame for this situation. After that, she said that now they needed to immediately take a hot bath and drink warm soup before bed, because the last thing they needed was to catch a cold. After that, the two of them turned around and went into the office, and the children stood for a while
and watched in surprise at everything that was happening. They certainly didn't expect this. Irene expected some incredibly severe punishment, perhaps even expulsion from the estate. But fortunately, this time everything worked out. Lydia came up to her and told the lady that they had to go already, because the bath was ready.
Iran went after her, and thought to herself that perhaps they were so disappointed that they didn't even see the point in counting her. But at that moment, the girl was suddenly stopped by Anton's hand. He told her not to think about herself there, but to just take a warm bath and have a good rest. When she heard these words, her heart melted. The girl smiled, thanked him for everything, and also asked that as soon as he warmed up, he too go to bed and rest. After this, their hands separated, and the girl and the maid went to the bathroom. Anton stood there for a while after that, watching her. And he himself thought about the fact that it was quite pleasant for him to call the girl his sister. When Irene took a bath, she returned to her room where the fireplace was already warmed up. She combed her hair and thought about what had happened that day. But then, suddenly someone knocked on her room door. She immediately thought that it was her maid, Liddy, and asked if it was true. But the girl was mistaken because after knocking, the door opened and the Duchess entered. Of course, Irene was very scared. She suddenly stood up and, seeing the Duchess, even knocked over the small chair she was sitting on. Summer turned to the girl and asked why she was so scared when she saw her. It was a really strange reaction. She asked her for forgiveness and said that she did not expect that it was the Duchess because she even knocked on the room. But she did not need to do this at all, because this is her estate. The girl herself thought that she was probably still angry with her, so she came to scold her, or even worsen her punishment. Then suddenly Irene remembered that she had her hair down, and the girl panicked because of this. She turned to the Duchess and asked her for forgiveness. The girl said that she would immediately take her hair back and braid it as usual. At that moment, Summer came closer to her and asked in a quiet voice why she was always so scared when she was near her. She asked if she had given any reason for Irene to be so afraid of her, because if so, she was very sorry. After a short silence, Irene finally decided to explain everything to her. She said that she simply really didn't want the lady to hate her. Even if she didn't live up to her expectations, the girl didn't want her mistress to regret taking her under her wing. And that's precisely why she treated her that way. Of course, Irene knew that these words would most likely only make her more angry. However, for some reason, she couldn't help but feel that she had to say it right now. Summer was silent for a while. But then she said that she never had children and had never raised anyone before meeting Irene. Therefore, it is possible that it was precisely because of ignorance and uncertainty that she involuntarily made the girl worry. But excessive modesty could also be harmful, and therefore she asked who told her at all, as if she might not be satisfied with it. At that moment, the woman straightened her hair. Irene immediately looked at her with a surprised look, but the Duchess said that loose hair suited her very well. She asked the girl to stop changing herself for her sake, because it was completely wrong. She should dress and behave the way she thought was right. At that moment, Irene could no longer hold back her tears. She burst into tears and thanked her ladyship for these words. They were truly very important to her. The Duchess told her not to cry, because she had already been caught in a heavy downpour. And if she had a cold, then trouble was definitely unavoidable. So she couldn't be too nervous about it. After that, they hugged, and Irene cried for some time. The hand on her shoulder that touched her cheek for the first time turned out to be very warm. From that day on, something changed in the girl. She no longer braided her hair or hid it behind a tightly tied braid. Anton now openly cared about her. He didn't care at all about any conventions. He showed this care to the girl as he wanted. Even the Duchess began to show concern in her own way when Anton suggested that his sister try the steak they had cooked for dinner. The Duchess said that given Irene's weak stomach, she shouldn't have eaten such fatty foods. Anton pointed to another dish and asked if he could share it with his sister. Leto replied that she would also feel heavy from this meat and would not be able to sleep at night. But fish with vegetables would be much easier to digest, so this was the best solution for her. At this point, the Duke wipes his mouth and says that if she eats everything they offer her, she will collapse from stomach pain, because it is definitely more than her daily allowance. When Irene heard all this, she immediately laughed. She was no longer even afraid to show such emotions. The girl even felt pleased to smile and laugh in front of her new family, but she didn't understand at all why she hadn't noticed all this before. They wouldn't scold her or drive her away, even if she laughed out loud.
no one would judge her for it. The ducal house had long ago accepted her into its family, not as a villain from a novel, but as a member of this family. But she still could not believe it. And that is why she pushed this information away from herself in every possible way.
But since that wonderful heart-to-heart talk with the Duchess, Irene really did gradually learn to be sincere. She stopped being afraid to show her true emotions. The girl began to laugh if she was having fun, screamed in surprise when she was afraid, got angry and locked herself in the room if something didn't suit her. Her life really changed dramatically. She finally began to feel free. And thus, 3 years passed. Every 3 years, the Duchy of Carlos held a special tournament to recruit members of the knightly order, and when that day came, Irene and her friends, whom she had made during this time, gathered together to watch them. Their order was famous for its elite warriors, so at that time, the sons of knightly families and noble families flocked to their estate. Irene noticed that Anton had also disappeared, and assumed that he was most likely preparing for the tournament, since she had not crossed paths with him for several days, and had not seen him at all. One of her friends suddenly approached her. She said that Lady Traylon was already 17, and therefore she asked if there was already any man in mind. Irene laughed nervously and said that she hadn't thought about that yet. Her friend, hearing this, was very indignant. She asked if she really planned to get engaged to someone of the Duchess's choice, even without falling in love, since she had not looked for suitors herself. But her other friends said that it wasn't worth talking like that, as if all they were dreaming about was a romance. And of course, they started arguing among themselves because one held this opinion, and the other said that she had other goals in life. In fact, the tournament really did become a place for social acquaintances. The Duchess specifically invited girls from neighboring lands so that they would have a chance to find a worthy groom for themselves. And while the girls were sitting on the veranda and talking to each other, a young guy suddenly approached them. It was obvious how much he was worried, but this guy plucked up his courage and turned to the beautiful red-haired lady and asked, "Are you Lady Traylon, a relative of the Duchess?" Irene immediately said that it was really her. But then she asked who this stranger was, since she had never met him before. The man asked her for forgiveness. He said that she was so charming that he was confused, and because of this, did not introduce himself. Pierre Servin bowed and said his name. And when the girl heard that he was from the Count's house of Sarvin, she was very surprised. Pierre said that in fact he had wanted to approach her for a long time. However, he felt a little awkward doing so. Well, now that he had plucked up his courage, he wanted to know if they could talk alone and perhaps get to know each other a little better. He was about to say something else when suddenly Anton came up to him from behind. He put his hand on his shoulder and said that the tournament participants had been called to line up, so they had to go immediately. He said that if Sir Pierre didn't hurry, he would simply be disqualified. And when Ren finally saw Anton, she wanted to say hello to him. But the man looked rather angry. He whispered in Pierrot's ear that he shouldn't hang around here any longer and make the commander wait for him alone. The nervous man laughed and asked for forgiveness. He said that he hadn't noticed how the hour had passed and that he would run there to avoid any problems. Anton was very angry. He asked who this frivolous idiot was. He didn't understand how the guy was even going to win this tournament, since he simply couldn't keep track of time. But Irene laughed and said that Anton should watch his language because there were still a lot of noble people here, and it was impossible to show disrespect. The guy was indignant. He said that, in fact, he was the one who cared about her. However, what was more important was that today, for the first time in a long time, they would finally have dinner together. He said that they had not had a calm conversation at the table for a long time, because everyone had a lot to do. But now this day had finally come. Irene, hearing this, immediately smiled. She was truly happy. They talked for a while, and after that the guy himself left. When he left, the girls still couldn't stop thinking about this Pierre. She was even a little wary of this man. After meeting with her friends, Irina went to meet Mrs. Summer. They sat and sorted through flowers and trimmed them to put them in a vase. The Duchess said that the third son of Count Servin was seriously interested in the girl. As soon as Irene heard this, she looked at her in surprise. But she shouldn't have been surprised, because the Duchess was always aware of all this. So she simply agreed with the woman in order not to anger her if anything happened. The Duchess said that he was not the heir, but he had a noble family, and even if he did not become a knight, his future was definitely secured. She also said that some people say that he has a meek character, Irena said that everything is possible. However, at the first meeting, he seemed quite kind to her. Then the Duchess cautiously asked if this meant that he was interested in her. Irene didn't understand what she was talking about, so she asked the woman to clarify. Then Summer looked her in the eyes and asked if the girl had thought about giving him a chance. Hearing this, Irene was very scared. Of course, now she understood what they were talking about. And because of this, she felt incredibly awkward. The Duchess, seeing her frightened expression, immediately said that she did not need to be so scared. She had not talked about an engagement at all. Perhaps they could get to know each other a little better. That's all. At that moment, Irene seriously thought about her offer. She understood that it was a good opportunity, and she saw no reason to refuse. In fact, names from the original novel began to appear. For example, Lady Bowen, who talked to her in the gazebo, and Pierre. And this meant that very soon the main character of this story would appear. And even if Irene survived, contrary to the plot, Anton, as in the book, should have fallen in love with her at first sight. And then the girl will again be left completely alone because he will give all of himself to this relationship with the main character. Therefore, Irene understood that for her own well-being, new acquaintances would not hurt her. So, she told the Duchess that she would meet him again. And so, when several days had passed since then, she went to the city with her maid to meet Pierre as they had planned. The maid said that she would wait for her not far from the carriage, and she could enjoy the time spent in peace. Irene thanked her, after which she went to the right meeting place and finally saw Pierre. When the guy came closer, she saw that he was not alone. Anton was behind him, and he looked very unfriendly. She immediately asked Anton what he was doing in this place. The guy explained that he heard that she and the Grey Sarvin were going for the sword. Therefore, he decided to join. He said that he understood swords much better than she did, and so she thought that his help would be good in this case. But Irene said that it was very impolite on his part to show up without an invitation. Therefore, she did not understand why he did this. Anton immediately turned to his partner and asked if Sarsarvin would really be against his company. Pierre was really worried about all this. He said that, of course, he wouldn't be against it. On the contrary, it was a great honor for him that he would go with him. He said that if the lady didn't mind, then of course they could all go together. And for him personally, there were no problems with this. Irene didn't have time to say anything, but she couldn't refuse him. So the guys went ahead, and she stayed behind. Of course, she was very angry, and even upset with Anton. She did not understand what he was planning, because he clearly did not just go with them for no reason. After some time, the maid finally decided to accompany Irene, and they went to a special store with swords, and were finally able to choose the perfect one for Pierre. The man smiled happily, and thanks to them, he was able to choose an excellent blade. So he was really very grateful to them for that. Anton said that this is exactly why he was here. So he is glad that everything went well and he liked the choice. Pierre, a little embarrassed, asked how he could thank them, but Irene replied that it was not worth it at all. She said that he simply had to show a decent result at the tournament. That would be enough. Pierre then came closer to the lady and said that if he won and received the laurel wreath, he wanted to know if he could present it to her as well. When Irene heard this, she was very shocked, because she knew that handing a laurel wreath to a woman after a tournament was the same as publicly proposing to her. She looked at the man and saw how worried and embarrassed he was. But at that moment, Anton spoke up. He looked at him with a murderous gaze and asked what he was even saying. He warned Pierre to watch his language, or else it would all end very badly. The guy even swung at him. Irene realized that she needed to intervene in all of this. She grabbed his hand and, asking Pierre for forgiveness, said that she would like to discuss this if he still wins the wreath. Anton looked at him in surprise. The girl also looked at him with a stern look. She really wanted him not to continue such a scene anymore, because she was ashamed of him. She understood that if he hit Pierre now, the punishment would be much more serious than just skipping dinner, as it happened that time. So she had to prevent all this. At that moment, Lady Bauman suddenly appeared from behind. Seeing Irene, she immediately decided to approach and greeted her. When the girl noticed her friend, she came closer to her and asked what she was doing in this place, because it was really amazing. She explained that their trading house was located not far from this place, and she was just heading home. Then she looked at Pierre and asked if this meant that she had already had close contact with this man. They started discussing all this, and the girl even thought that Irene had decided to listen to her advice. Meanwhile, Anton was standing nearby. He decided to intervene in this conversation because he did not want it to continue. So the guy turned to Lady Bowen and said that she had come just in time. The man smiled and came closer to Pierre, nudged him, and said that he was already heading in the same direction as her. So he asked if they would like to walk together so that they would not be so lonely. Irene was very shocked. She did not understand why her brother was doing such things. But the girl herself was very embarrassed. She did not understand whether she really had to go with Sir Servant. Pierre was embarrassed and immediately said that he had to accompany Lady Traylon home. This is exactly what etiquette required of him. But Anton told him not to worry. At that moment, he came closer to Irene, and grabbing her by the shoulder, said that she and her sister could return home together. So everything was fine. The girl did not understand what nonsense he was talking about. She decided that it was better to just leave quickly before he made another scene, so she simply had to agree to this condition. Laughing, the girl said that everything was correct. They did it in the same house, so it was logical, but she herself pulled her hand away from him and did not understand why he suddenly decided to take it. But for some reason, Anton took her hand again and told his little sister to go. And in the end, they actually did go back. When they finally got into the carriage, Irene decided to start this unpleasant conversation. But a conversation was needed. She asked what all this was about. The man looked at her in surprise and, with a smile on his face, asked what she was talking about. He pretended as if nothing special had happened. Irene could not believe that he actually behaved this way, and at the same time pretended that he had done nothing wrong. She said that he had been following her like that and had ruined their meeting. So she would like to hear an adequate explanation of why he had done this. Anton smiled and asked what he meant by spoiled. Because he wanted to buy a sword, he helped him, and the guy didn't do anything bad, of course. The girl wanted to argue with him and prove she was right, but she realized that it was useless. For some reason, he would still insist on his own. Anton, seeing her expression, immediately asked if she was really angry. Then he looked at her with a pitiful look and asked if it was really because he came to the meeting. Irene was a little embarrassed. Of course, she didn't want to snap at him, so she turned away and said that it wasn't exactly because of this. Then Anton asked if she wasn't angry with him, then he could sit next to her. When she looked at this look, she realized that he knew perfectly well that she could not be angry with him when he looked like this. Because of this, she became even more upset. That's why she said that he could do whatever he wanted. And at that moment, Anton sat down next to her. He hugged the girl and was very happy about it. He said that he was really sorry that he upset her, so he asked her not to frown so much. He was very sorry that everything turned out this way. Aran simply asked that next time he behave much more restrained. But at that moment, the guy suddenly lay down on her lap, which surprised her greatly. From the day she heard his sincere words, she simply could not treat him coldly. So Irene may have allowed him too much. In front of strangers, he is unapproachable and silent. However, with her, for some reason, he became too tender. This pleasantly surprised her. However, she wanted him to show his true self more often. Irene put her hand on his head and thought that she was giving him a break because he was still a child. But next time he would definitely get punished for what he did. Then Anton suddenly turned to his little sister and asked her to tell him whether she really liked Pierre. The girl replied that in fact, this was not the case. That was not the point. Then Anton stood up and, looking at her, asked why she pulled her hand away as soon as he touched her. He asked if she was really afraid that he might misunderstand all this. At that moment, a smile even appeared on his face. Irene looked at him in surprise. She didn't understand what kind of a strange feeling she had with him. She felt déjà vu because of his innocent tone. Original story. Anton was the embodiment of goodness. However, now he was so careful that a lot of pain was still visible in his eyes. She wondered whether he would become that kind young man from the novel when he grew up, and she was even a little scared that this might not happen. The girl laughed awkwardly and immediately asked what he meant when he said that the guy could misunderstand it. She didn't know what he was thinking. She again moved her hand away from his and explained that she was simply confused. He grabbed her hand so suddenly, and it seemed very strange to her. Smiling, Anton pointed in his direction and said that he was still a child, There was nothing prejudiced in his behavior, so anything could be expected from him. Of course, Irene couldn't argue with this, because formally it was all true, but still, she was quite alarmed by his behavior that day. Several days passed in vague unrest. Meanwhile, the festive evening in honor of the fencing tournament organized by the ducal house approached. Irene wore a beautiful white dress with lace. She looked simply amazing. Anton also dressed up for this event. When they met and saw each other, the guy was very amazed. He didn't expect that she would look so beautiful. Anton was supposed to accompany her. However, after he saw the girl in her outfit, he couldn't take a step. She became embarrassed and asked if she really looked that strange. The guy extended his hand and said that this was not true at all. This dress suited her very well, and she looked amazing. Irene thanked him for the compliment, after which she took his hand and, smiling, said that he also looked very good. However, they went into the hall, and the man did not understand why they had to dress up like that. He was not even allowed to participate in the tournament, so it was strange. In fact, according to the rules of the fencing tournament, one can only participate from the age of 16. So the Duke, of course, refused 15-year-old Anton. The girl tried to console him and said that he would take part in the next tournament, so he shouldn't be upset. It would be soon. But Anton was still unhappy because the next tournament was supposed to be in 3 years. It was too long to wait. The girl was very surprised to hear this. She asked what exactly he meant, but Anton explained that in order to inherit the title of Duke as soon as possible, he must show that he is capable of leading knights. If he waits for the appointed time, he doesn't know when it might happen. Irene suddenly laughed and asked why he was in such a hurry to get the title. She said that the Duke was still very full of strength, so there was no great need for this. The guy suddenly looked at her and said in a quiet voice that he did it for her. Irene certainly didn't expect to hear this. She looked at him in surprise and asked what exactly he meant. He said that the head of the house decides everything that concerns her, and if he becomes a duke earlier, he will be able to make her life easier. Irene, hearing this, now understood everything and thought that for a moment his face seemed so alien to her. Because of this, she was quite scared. But fortunately, everything worked out. Anton moved closer to her and said that there would be much more opportunity to help her. Therefore, he really would like to become a duke as soon as possible. Irene smiled and replied that she was, of course, pleased. However, she asked if he really wanted this title only because of her. Anton said that he always said that she was the most important thing to him, and considering everything she did for him, this was the least he could pay her. When they finally arrived at the event, the first thing they were greeted by was Lady's younger brother Heather and Aton's training comrade. He saw Anton and immediately approached him. Iran also greeted him. When the guy saw Lady, he said that she looked simply dazzling that day. Anton moved his friend a little further away from them. He looked very indignant and told him that he could have gone straight to the gym, so he didn't understand why he decided to come. The guy was very surprised to hear this indignation. He said that he wanted to go to the hall with his dear friends, and that was why he came. But Irene noticed that he came without his older sister, and asked if she was really in the waiting room. The guy said that if she meant Heather, then the girl had left earlier. She was probably already in Riverhall at that moment. At that moment, Anton was trying to push the guy away so that he would finally leave. But Irene, hearing about Riverhall, was very surprised, because the celebration was supposed to be in Belmont Hall. Derek was even more surprised when he heard about this, because their invitations clearly stated that the reception was to take place in Riverhall. At that moment, Anton realized that the mistake was his fault. He had mixed up the location on the invitation. That was why they had received the wrong ones. Irene started walking towards that very hall. She asked her brother who he had sent them to because it was a serious offense. The guy replied that he had sent it to some familiar houses. Irene calmed down a little. She said that it was very good that at least these halls were located close to each other. She believed that if they met the guests in person, everything would be fixed. Anton asked her for forgiveness and said that he would personally apologize to him for this. When they arrived at their destination, the girl saw them. She realized that those who had gone to the wrong room had gathered there, but she saw what a terrible atmosphere there was around them. Irene became very wary. She came closer and asked if something had happened. Anton also came to his guests and asked what was happening there. One of his guests bowed and said that when they arrived at this place, the door was closed and they decided that they had made a mistake. But suddenly, you stop the noise inside. And when they finally opened the doors, they saw Lady Bowen and Sir Piero. They enjoyed their secret date. As soon as Irene heard this, she could not believe that Pierre was with Heather. For her, it was a big blow. At that moment, Derek ran to his sister. He asked the tearful girl if all of this was really true. Kazar wiped away her tears and looked at him. And the guy asked, did she really stay alone with Sir Pierre on purpose? The girl looked at the man and couldn't even show anything. She looked at Pierre and saw how much he began to feel shy and worried. Then she realized that he definitely wouldn't stand up for her. Because of this, she went over to her brother and cried even harder. At that moment, people started talking about all this. They believed that in this case, the families would only have to get them engaged. Otherwise, this scandal would seriously tarnish their good names. Irene panicked at that moment. She knew she needed to call the Duchess immediately to resolve the situation. That's why I turned to Anton, but then I suddenly saw some kind of evil smile on his face, and because of this I became wary. She didn't understand why he was smiling in such a situation. Anyone would have been confused, and would have at least shown their concern. However, Anton had a completely different reaction. Moreover, Heather was the sister of his close friend, so he should definitely be worried. Irene was already getting ready to go after the Duchess, but did not have time to do so because the woman herself had already arrived. She heard all this noise and commotion and went inside and asked what had happened to them all. The arriving Duchess, like a conductor, took the situation into her own hands. The guests were carefully led to the right room. Auxerre and Pierre, under an elegant pretext, left the evening, and the Duchess took Anton away with her, and her expression was colder than usual. She said that he would have to immediately explain the situation that had happened. Later, Irene was called, and was left alone with the Duchess. She was wondering what Anton had said to her that was the reason she had been behaving so quietly until now. But then suddenly, having come to her normal state, the Duchess turned to the girl and said that she should stay away from her brother. Irene was very surprised to hear this. She asked what she meant. Mrs. Summer explained that this child would stop at nothing to achieve her goals. His mother was both exactly the same, so you always have to be on your guard and act very carefully for your own good. Then the Duchess explained that he had deliberately mixed up the holes in the invitations, and even now he did not feel a drop of remorse for his actions. This was precisely what frightened her most. Irene immediately began to stand up for him. She said that this was not at all the case. The woman was mistaken. He was not at all like his mother was. He tried to become a worthy heir, but the Duchess suddenly raised her voice at her for the first time in a very long time and told Irene to do what she was told. The girl was very surprised. She had never seen the Duchess so angry. And because of this, she suddenly fell silent and simply looked at her in surprise. Summer said that she was saying this for her own good. So for her own well-being, she just needed to listen to this advice and take certain measures. After this meeting, Irene went to her room. As soon as she left the lady's office, Anton immediately met her there. The man greeted her with a satisfied smile, and Irene was immediately very surprised when she saw him. She asked if he had really been waiting for her outside the office all this time. The guy came closer to her and said that everything was exactly like this. He knew that she would be shocked. He could not leave her alone after everything that happened, especially after the conversation with the Duchess. At that moment, he hugged the girl and said that this servant had acted very lowly. You could not even imagine that this guy could be so ignorant, dare to show sympathy to Irene. And he himself secretly began dating another at that moment. Iran looked at Anton and again saw that very smile on his face. She turned to the man and asked if he knew about their relationship. The guy made a surprised expression and asked what it was saying, but Iran continued. She said that she believed that he knew and deliberately indicated the wrong hall on the invitations to put them in a bad light. Anton, of course, began to deny all of this. He said that, of course, this could not have happened, after which he asked if the Duchess had really told her about this. But when Irene looked at his face, she realized that there was not a drop of remorse there. She had never seen him like this before, and it scared her very much. Irene could not contain her emotions. She suddenly screamed at him and told him not to pretend. She just wanted to know why he did it. Anton suddenly put his hand on her cheek shield and told his sister that it was just a coincidence that the Duchess did not react too strongly, and because of this, she probably imposed this thought on her. He asked if he, being the Duke's heir, would deliberately undermine his own credibility. At that moment, Irene remembered all the words that the Duchess had said to her about how he had done all this because of her, that she had not rejected the advances of her son to the Sarvon family, which is why he had decided to take extreme measures and eliminate the rival within himself. But of course, the girl didn't understand why he had to do this for her. It was all very strange. Then, Summer explained that she could no longer close her eyes. She wanted the girl to remember that his gaze was always directed only at her. And now, when Irene stood next to him, she really noticed that he always looked at her at every opportunity and tried to be close. Anton stroked her head and asked if she really thought he was capable of such a thing. Except, if it was about her safety, then in that case it would be possible. Then Irene realized that most likely the Duchess was right. He became completely different, as if he was preoccupied with her. At that moment, Anton suddenly noticed that her whole body began to tremble. He assumed that it was because she was cold, but in fact, it was from fear. He hugged her again and said that they needed to bring everything back inside. He would take her there and asked her to just trust him, and then everything would be fine. At that moment, the girl realized that Anton was most likely truly obsessed with her, and this thought frightened her even more. After she returned to her room, Lydia noticed that the lady was somehow different. She asked if she still hadn't said hello, because she needed to know, since dinner was about to be served. Irene replied that she should convey that she would dine in her room again that day. This continued for several days, and the girl did not want to leave there. She felt safe in the room. After what happened at the ball before the tournament, she felt very awkward being around Anton, so she simply avoided him in every possible way. She understood that if the Duchess's words were true, she didn't know how she could stay close to him now. If every time she looked at him, she thought only about what exactly he felt and thought about her. Irene couldn't even imagine that she might end up in a situation where he, obsessed with her, would lead her to a bad ending, because she tried in every way to avoid all of this. Moreover, the palace just sent an invitation to this year's judo and bachelor's ball. While Iran is busy preparing, she will finally be able to keep a normal distance and not arouse suspicion. The girl decided that, perhaps, over time, his interest in her would subside. She really hoped for this, because she was even afraid to be around Anton now. While she was thinking, she didn't notice how quickly time flew by, and now she and Anton were already heading to the capital for this very ball for which she had been preparing for so long. The Duchess, seeing the girl off, said that she should have accompanied her. However, she was unwell. Irene understood all this perfectly well, so she did not take offense or insist. When she told the Duchess not to worry, the woman listened to her after that. She asked everything. Or else, Irene kept her distance from Anton. Remembering this, she became sad. She said that this is exactly why she even specially scheduled her departure to the capital for another day, in order not to cross paths with him. The Duchess said that she was a great fellow, after which she added that the journey to the capital would take several days, so she advised the girl to be sure to take care of herself. And when Irene finally set off, having driven away from the duchy, she suddenly felt very ill. She didn't understand what was happening to her, because for some reason, the girl couldn't even take a breath. It felt as if the carriage was about to turn over at any moment. Then she suddenly thought that, in the original story, her character died because of this. There were no details, but everyone suspected that Anton, hating her, had arranged this assassination attempt. However, then she suddenly thought that perhaps he was not even involved in all of this. Irene understood that perhaps today was the very day when she was supposed to die, according to the plot. Because of this, she was seized by panic and began to tremble. The maid, as soon as she saw that something was happening to her, immediately ran up and asked what was wrong with her, and Ren wanted someone to help her. She was very scared. The maid tried to calm her down. She told her to breathe deeply, and after that, she ordered the carriage to be stopped immediately. At that moment, Irene turned her head towards the window, and then she saw Anton there, riding a horse. Eventually, the carriage was stopped. The man helped Irene out into the street. He sat her down on the soft grass and held the girl's hand to help her calm down. After a short silence, he asked if she was feeling a little better now. The girl said that everything was fine now, and thanked him. Anton asked if she had considered stopping in the nearest town so that she could recuperate and then head to the capital. Irene said that she was now okay, so he didn't have to worry. After that, she looked him straight in the eyes and asked what brought him to this place. She left early on purpose so as not to cross paths with him. He explained that he could not let her go alone to the capital, prepared all the necessary things, and went in the second carriage. He himself caught up with her on horseback. He took her hand, and at that moment, his eyes also began to well up with tears. He asked if she really hated him that much. He said that since that night, she had been avoiding him, and if today he had done wrong, he would like her to say so. Then he would immediately return to the estate and would not be so intrusive. For a while, Irene was silent. She heard his trembling, pleading voice, and it was as if she were back on that stormy day when he was only 14. Then she hugged him and said that she would always be on his side. Now the girl took her hand back, and Anton immediately realized that the answer would probably not be what he wanted to hear. But at that moment, she put her palms on his cheeks and told him to raise his head, and asked, with a smile on his face, if she could ever hate him. The guy was a little surprised when he heard this at first, but then a smile appeared on his face, and they touched foreheads. At that moment, he was the happiest person in the world. Iran's last big silence was that she just wanted him to become worthy of becoming a game that everyone would admire. Anton, hearing this, immediately smiled. He said that if this is what she wanted, then he would certainly become exactly like that for her. She then asked if he had promised her this, and the guy did even more. He swore that he would do it. He explained that her wishes were a real law for him. So a few more hours passed, and they finally reached the capital. Irene had to sit in the carriage for a while because the maid went to find a hotel where they could stay. When Lytia returned, they had already found the right place. In fact, during the remaining time on the way, Irene thought about a lot of things. She decided that if fate really connected her with Anton, then it had to make him a good character, just like in the original story. When the guy helped her out of the carriage, the girl realized that all those worries that had been tormenting her all this time suddenly simply disappeared into thin air. After a few days, they finally reached their destination, settled in the city residence of the ducal house, and immediately went to visit Marquis Stephen. There, they were immediately greeted by the butler, who bowed and greeted Mr. Carlos and Mrs. Trelin, and said that he was very glad to see them at the residence of the Stefan family. When the girl began to approach the entrance, she was slightly overcome by panic. Marquis Stefan was a rather respected man, but she was panicking because of something else. It was in this residence that the main character of the novel lived. Her name was Hesti Stefan, and now they definitely had to meet her. They went inside, and all the time on the way to the living room, Irene was thinking about what kind of girl she was. The butler opened the doors to the required room and said that the Marquise would soon come out to them. But when they went inside, the guy and the girl heard screams coming from there. A female voice screamed loudly and said that she had not stolen the blue topaz. She continued to scream and asked why her mother believed only that there was something. And they continued to argue. Irene immediately came forward in order to understand what was happening there, and, if necessary, she could even help. At this point, they continued to argue. The girl became so angry that she couldn't even stay on her feet and fell, but Anton managed to react in time. He grabbed the girl and didn't let her hit herself. Her mother immediately screamed and asked if everything was okay with her daughter. Her sister was also standing nearby, and as soon as she saw this scene, she immediately became wary. When Irene saw this beautiful blonde girl, she couldn't believe that she really was the main character of the original story. Soon after everything calmed down, the Marquise introduced her daughters to the guests. The eldest daughter was called Vesta, and the youngest, Hestia. The woman sighed heavily and said that, in fact, despite the fact that they were twins, their characters were completely different, and this was immediately noticeable. Her youngest was always very modest, but Vesta was quite impudent and ignorant. So the mother yelled at her eldest daughter and told her to immediately apologize to the guests. The girl immediately became indignant and said that it wasn't her fault that Topaz had disappeared and that she hadn't pushed her sister on purpose. Vesta didn't understand why she always had to apologize in such cases. The girl, without saying anything, turned around and started to leave. She said that it was unfair, so she wasn't going to do it. The Marquise asked the guests for forgiveness. She said that, despite the fact that the girl was older, she behaved even worse than the younger one, and she was very ashamed of this.